Well, good morning to everyone, and welcome back if you attended the last webinar, and welcome to this webinar if you weren't at the last webinar. And I'm really delighted that so many people have joined us today. And of course, we're going to have two webinars this morning with a break in between, so we can move around a little bit in between. We're going to begin with the Identifying Ladybirds Part 2. So this is some of the perhaps less common species that we might encounter. And as before, we have Caroline Wills-Wright, who is extremely grateful to you for organising all of this for us. She's behind the scenes and can take any of your questions in the question part. If you have any technical issues at all, do just put it into that questions tab that I hope you can see. We also have Martin with us today, who is based within the Biological Record Centre at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and he's going to be chairing the session for us. And thank you, Martin, for joining us. And it's Pete and I who will be giving, in a tag team kind of fashion, the webinar. And we realise we have quite a lot to cover in the half an hour that we've allocated, but we are recording this and we will post it on YouTube just as we have with the previous one. Please do send in your questions. We are going to pause halfway through to take some of those questions, and we will answer all of the questions afterwards as well and post the answers on our website. So I'm looking forward to sharing some Ladybird excitement with you this morning. So just to give you a quick overview, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction again to sort of some of the main pointers of identifying adult ladybirds. And then I'm going to go through some of the less common species, focus a little bit on some of the habitats as well, where you might find them. We'll then have a bit of a break for some questions. And then Pete will take over with going through some more of the ladybirds and pointing you in the direction of some additional resources to find out more. So just to mention, we have already had one webinar where we covered some of the common and widespread adult ladybirds and how to identify them and ways of recording. And you can see that again, it's available on YouTube. And we'll be delighted to take any questions on that previous webinar as well, if you wish to drop us an email or send us a tweet through @UKLadybirds. So I mentioned before in the last webinar some of the features that you can use to help you identify ladybird adults, and I thought it was useful just to remind ourselves of those features. So ladybirds are small to medium-sized beetles. They're usually round or oval, but we'll see as we move through the presentation today that some of them can be quite flattened and quite elongate. Often they're brightly coloured and patterned on their wing cases, on the elytra. They have short clubbed antennae, and remembering that leaf beetles, for instance, that can look very like ladybirds, have much longer antennae. And if you just take a very close look at their feet, you can see that they have 4 segments, but the third is very, very small, and so only 3 can be seen. So I find the most useful things for identifying ladybirds is to take a look at the pronotum, and that's that structure just behind the head that I've pointed out on this slide here, that's very speckled on this ladybird here. That can be an extremely useful place to begin in identifying the ladybirds. Looking at the legs is also an excellent feature. Look at the leg colour. Are they brown or are they black, for instance? That can be extremely helpful. And size is important too. So remembering all of these different features to help you pull together the clues that will allow you to identify these ladybirds. So we covered these common and widespread ladybirds in the previous webinar, and as I said, it's available on YouTube, and we'd be delighted to have your comments or your thoughts. And for me, it's just really lovely to see them all together in this panel, such very, very beautiful beetles. So we thought we'd move to some of the slightly less common, and the 11-spot ladybird, which is the first one that I'm mentioning here, Coccinella undecimpunctata, is relatively common. It seems to become a little less common over time. Certainly when I was a child, I was seeing it a lot more, and more often than not nowadays we're seeing it in coastal locations. It's quite a tiny ladybird when you see it. It is smaller than some of the other Coccinellas, but it has that very characteristic pronotum marking of the other close relatives, the Coccinellas. And you can see it has those 11 spots, and although that can change a little, it tends to be very noticeable by those additional spots. This is a hieroglyphic ladybird, and this one causes me lots of excitement. I haven't seen it myself that many times, despite looking extremely hard, but I'm always delighted when I see other people's records. It's another of these ladybirds that can take a variety of different forms, and actually it can be completely melanic, and then it can be quite tricky to identify. But those little white markings that you can see at the top edge of the wing cases, kind of abutting the pronotum, are still evident when it's on the melanic form. But it's named because of those hieroglyphic type markings that it has right at the very top of the wing cases. But it can appear in this quite kind of checkered form as well. And then it's a case of looking at that pronotum marking. So it can look a little bit like a 10-spot ladybird when it's marked in this way. But take a look at those two different pronotum markings, that sort of speckly one of the 10-spot ladybird, and also that sort of very solid trapezoid type marking that you can see on the hieroglyphic ladybird. And the leg colour as well is certainly a place to go to, with these very black legs on the hieroglyphic and the browner legs on the 10-spot ladybird. The scarce 7-spot ladybird, Coccinella magnifica, is a real treat to see. Within the UK, it is really quite restricted in its distribution. It often is associated with wood ants. It's amazing to watch it in its habitat scurrying over pine trees, and I've had the pleasure of seeing it quite a number of times on the Dorset Heaths, but also on the Surrey Heaths as well. You'll be thinking, well, that looks extremely like the 7-spot ladybird, and you would be quite right. It does look very like the 7-spot ladybird. You need to turn it over and take a look at the underside. And this can be a fiddle, but it is possible, and they do oblige at times by moving their legs into the right position. So you can take a look at those white markings below the legs. And for the 7-spot, it just has one pair of white markings on those middle legs. But if you have a look on the scarce 7-spot, it has an extra pair of those white markings. More often than not, we kind of get that sighting that we see on the right side of the slide, where it's a little bit obscured, but thankfully you can get a quick glimpse that gives you that certainty that it is a scarce 7-spot ladybird, or indeed a 7-spot ladybird. The 5-spot ladybird, Coccinella quinquepunctata, is another very, very special ladybird to see. It is rare within the UK. It occurs around disturbed river shingle. It's amazing that it lives by these really fast flowing rivers, and the one that I've put on the inset there is the first one I ever recorded, and it looks such a hostile habitat that it occurs in, but again extremely well adapted to that habitat, and flourishing on the tributaries of the River Severn and indeed the Spey in Scotland. So this is a very typical habitat for 5-spot ladybirds. And you'll find them scurrying around this shingle, and just a few meters back is where you start to find the 7-spot ladybirds and other species that are more commonly associated with the herbaceous vegetation. Just because I think they're such beautiful photos, I thought I'd put in another picture of the habitat, and this is on a tributary of the River Severn. And people do mistake 7-spot ladybirds sometimes as being 5-spot ladybirds, but I think knowing that they have quite a restricted habitat can be helpful. But it is evident that they don't have those 2 forward spots that the 7-spot ladybird has. So they do have that reduced spot number, with the spot that's just behind the pronotum forming the 5th spot. This is Hippodamia variegata, the Adonis ladybird. And I always think of this ladybird as quite small, it's quite elongate. It's not a similar size to the 11-spot ladybird. And, but it looks to me always as if the spots are sort of falling off the back of it. But of course, that's not a necessarily reliable way to identify the Adonis ladybird. But if you take a look again at that pronotum, you'll see it's got a very distinctive pattern, and often with those little white eye spot markings, if you like, on either side. And that's very characteristic, the sort of pronotum pattern of Hippodamia. It's quite a common species across the UK. It favours warmer habitats that can be found on sort of the shingle around quarries, for instance, or around the coast. So this is the 13-spot ladybird, Hippodamia tredecimpunctata, and this is one I haven't seen myself in the wild. I have been very tempted to nip down to Sussex in the past to see it. I don't see that's going to be happening this year, but it's a species that typically colonizes and then goes extinct within the UK, but we have had recent records of it. Again, you can see it's got that very characteristic pronotum marking. It's quite a small ladybird. It's often found in more marshy habitats, but a very, very special one to see, and I'm looking forward to my first sighting of this one. The water ladybird is quite a common species. Again, this one I don't see that often. It can be found around reeds, and I think what's really special about this beautiful ladybird, and it is quite characteristic when you see it as being quite different, is that through the winter months it's very much a sort of buff colour with the black markings as it tucks itself away into the overwintering habitat of the reeds. But during the springtime, its charismatic, bright coloration, its warning colorations develop, and it becomes a much more reddish coloured ladybird. Quite a dramatic colour change, and really fascinating that it has that strategy. So we're going to take some questions now before I move across to Pete, and Martin's going to chair those questions for us. So Martin and Pete are going to switch on their webcams and take any questions that you might have. Over to you, Martin.
I was just about, they're just about coming through now. We haven't had many questions so far, but there's a few popping in just as we speak. The first of which is referring to the water ladybird that you were just talking about, Helen. Is it the only one that changes colour in that way?
It is the only one that changes in that really dramatic way. So often what we see, and people will be seeing now, the new 7-spot ladybirds emerging from their pupae, for instance, and they often appear a really bright orange when they first appear from their pupae, and over time, as the pigments get laid down, they become a much deeper red. So the ladybirds that we see at the moment, the 7 spots, we can see a mixture of those that have gone through the overwintering and those that have just appeared as newly emerged adults. But that's more about the pigments being laid over time in the same sort of colour range. So it is the only one that goes through that really dramatic change.
Okay. And one more question on the water ladybird. Is that one spreading north? Is it likely to reach Scotland anytime soon?
So in terms of its distribution trend, I need to take a look at that again, actually, to remind myself. It's not one that stands out in my mind as spreading particularly northward, but I know that we have had quite a number of sightings from northern England, so it's quite possible that it will become more common and widespread going north. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Pete.
Yeah, no, the same, I think.
Excellent question.
I don't think it's one that's particularly changed in its distribution. Perhaps I can relate that to the start of the next section, if that... Should we move on, Martin? Is that appropriate now?
Perhaps there's another question to do with the distribution and so on. So perhaps if we pick up one more at the moment, Pete,
sure.
And that's to do with the
of course.
in Ireland, that on the maps that we've been looking at, the distribution in Ireland seems to be very limited, and the question is whether that's a genuine thing or to do with the recording effort that's been or the records that are available.
Actually, it's a really excellent question, and I should point out there's a modelled distribution. So what we've done is we've taken the records that we have, and then we've created a model of this sort of predicted, if you like, distribution, taking into account some of the absence of recording and lower intensity. The more records we get, the more accurate the picture is, and we would love to have more records through the Republic of Ireland, and indeed the National Biodiversity Data Centre in the Republic of Ireland would be delighted to hear from you with any records. But we can also see gaps across the UK as well, and there is certainly a case that in areas that there is less recording going on than others. And we really hope over time we'll see a more sort of even pattern of recording, but certainly at the moment those are model distributions, so they're not too off what we would expect to be seeing. But we'd love you to prove us wrong with your records.
Okay, that's good. There's a few more questions that come in, so perhaps we can try and pick up some more at the next stop.
That
So
would be
I think
great.
we're
Yeah.
handing over to you, Pete, next for the next session.
Yes, please.
I'm
That'd be
handing to
great.
Pete. Thanks very much.
So, Helen, if you could move the slide on. Great. So in terms of changing distributions, the kidney spot ladybird is one that I was going to briefly refer to, because that's one that we are seeing a few more records in southern Scotland. So that seems to be occurring a little bit more in the north, perhaps, than it used to be. Anyway, this is the first of a couple of species I'd like to talk about, which are closely related and which are black with red markings. And they're in a particular group of ladybirds, along with the pine ladybird, and I'll show you pictures of all three together in a moment. But on this kidney spot ladybird, it's got quite a noticeable rim around the wing cases and just two bright red spots. It pretty much always looks the same. There are no white markings on it at all, just plain black with the two red spots and the rim. So if we can look at that in terms of the next slide, Helen, as well. And this is a close relative of the kidney spot ladybird. This is the heather ladybird. And the markings are a bit more splodgy on this one, so there's kind of almost like a dotted line going across the middle as opposed to clear, distinct spots. But otherwise, looks pretty similar. But they're in different habitats, and if we can move to the next slide, Helen. I'd just like to show you the three species that are closely related all together. The kidney spot ladybird, that's generally found on things like ash trees and willow trees, but would tend to be found on the bark of the trees. Then we have the heather ladybird in the middle, on things like small conifers and heather in a heathland habitat. And then on the right hand side, we've got the pine ladybird. That's one that we dealt with in our first webinar because it's much more common, and that's got the four spots on it, comma-shaped ones at the front, and is a bit more of a generalist, but tends to like pine trees, but also deciduous trees too. And you can see, particularly on that pine ladybird, the feature of all three of these species, this rim around the wing cases that's sort of fairly obvious on that picture. So some people do get confused between these black and red native species and red and black forms of the harlequin ladybird. So just a quick note on that. You can see pictures of two different black harlequin ladybirds at the bottom. So the things to distinguish those from the native black and red species is firstly the lack of this prominent rim around the wing cases. Secondly, the presence of these big white sort of splodgy false eye markings on the harlequin, which you wouldn't get on any of the black and red species above. And also the leg colour would be another thing to look for, the harlequin having sort of red or brown legs and the ones at the top all having black legs. Final point on that, the harlequins are quite a bit bigger than any of those species above. Okay, next one please. So we're going to stay in a habitat of kind of coniferous woodland and particularly pine trees to look at a close relative of the harlequin. So this has the same genus as the harlequin ladybird. It's a Harmonia species, but this is the cream-streaked ladybird, and it's a beautiful species, and it comes in two different forms. So the one on the left that gives it its full scientific name has 4 spots. And you can just see on the edges of each side of the wing cases, there's a pair of little black spots. Otherwise, fairly plain, but with the kind of creamy streaked markings on the wing cases. What I find is actually the more common form is the spottier one. So the one on the other picture that has 16 spots. And that number of spots really doesn't vary. So it's either got the 4, as in the left-hand picture, or the 16 spots, as in the other one. It's much sort of flatter and less rounded and domed than the harlequin ladybird, and has these kind of very streaky markings that gives it its common name. And the next one, please. Staying in coniferous woodland, we might find the 18-spot ladybird. In our first webinar, we spoke about the cream spot ladybird, and this one is fairly similar in size and coloration to the cream spot, but this one's got rather different markings. And in fact, if we move the slide on, Helen, I think there's a comparison between the two. So whereas the cream spot ladybird that you can see at the bottom has got a kind of a straight row of 6 pale spots quite near the front, the spots aren't all in a straight line on the 18 spot ladybird. And also those very front spots with the arrow pointing to them are kind of L-shaped on the 18 spot ladybird. So if you look at the two together, it can be fairly easy to tell them apart. There's also quite a habitat difference. So the cream spot ladybird would normally be in deciduous trees and the 18 spot in coniferous trees. The orange ladybird is another one we spoke about in the first webinar that could be confused with these because sometimes it can be a bit darker. But again, it's looking at the kind of patterning of the spots on that one that's a little bit different. Okay, next one, please. This is the larch ladybird. So again, another species in coniferous woodland, larch trees, but also firs and other evergreen trees. This is one that's really common in Scotland, even into northern Scotland. And it's rather a plain ladybird in some respects, but also really rather striking and beautiful. Some people might glance at it and not immediately realize it's a ladybird because it's rather unspotted. And it tends to just have perhaps a few streaky darker markings on the wing cases, along with this darker band down the middle, but otherwise fairly plain wing cases. It's got this characteristic sort of M-shaped marking on the pronotum that you can see on this and some of the other ladybird species. So that's the larch ladybird. And the next one, thank you. Fine to go on. The last one to talk about from similar habitat again, the striped ladybird. So we've got a number of these species that are really specialists of coniferous woodland and coniferous tree habitats. The striped ladybird is particularly on Scots pine trees, and again is one that does well in the north, particularly in Scotland. Beautiful species, and it's one of our largest ladybirds. So it's similar size to a large harlequin ladybird or an eyed ladybird, and is very brown and very standard in its appearance. It always looks pretty much similar to this. Sometimes the pronotum marking is rather darker in colour, but these kind of stripy pale markings rather than clear spots. So that's the striped ladybird. And the next one, please. I think this is the last one to speak about, and then we've covered all of the 26 bright and colourful conspicuous ladybirds. This is over the course of the 2 webinars. This last one is much more restricted in its distribution and is a very southerly species. It's the newest arrival of our large ladybirds, and it's called the briny ladybird. It looks like this all the time. There's no variation really. So it's bright orange, 11 black spots, very distinctive, and the pronotum is just plain bright orange. It's quite a large ladybird, and it's a little bit hairy, so you can perhaps see that on the picture. And it's really restricted in both its geographic areas that it's found. So far it's only been found in mainly in London, Surrey, parts of Oxfordshire, and odd little records from elsewhere. But we think it's gradually going to spread. It moves with its host plant, or rather we think is restricted to its host plant, which is white bryony. And it's a herbivorous species, so the adults and larvae feed, as far as we know, just on that plant. Okay, the next one, please. So the final slide to leave you with is a picture from the Surrey Heathlands, just to give an example of the kind of range of species that you can see at one particular spot. So Helen and I have been to places like this quite a number of times to try and find ladybirds, and if we're lucky we may find 12, maybe even 15 species on the same day of different ladybirds. So many of the ones we've spoken about in this second webinar the scarce seven spot at the top, the heather ladybird in the sort of heather and low vegetation, and on the trees perhaps cream spot ladybirds, 18 spot ladybirds, and at the bottom striped ladybirds, all within that very lovely habitat. Lots of different microhabitats here. You know, you've got the mature pine trees, the younger emergent pines, birch trees, the heathers and the grassland and so on as well. So lots of different niches for many different species. And if we're lucky, perhaps hieroglyphic ladybirds. Helen and I have struggled often to find this one as much as we thought we would. So if we can move on. So that's the end of the webinar, except for some questions that hopefully we've got time for a few questions. We'd really like to thank everybody for the use of their images. All of the names on here have provided these lovely photos for the presentations. And just to remind you of a few resources that you might want to look at, the Field Studies Council charts for adult and larvae stages of the ladybirds. Perhaps you'd like to look at our field guide to ladybirds of Britain and Ireland, and also the website and social media are other things you might want to look at. So if we want to bring Martin and Helen back in and see if we have time for any questions.
Great, thanks, Pete. Yeah, a few more questions coming in. Couple referring back to the finding ladybirds, actually, with the scarce seven spot. There was a question about somebody who's looked at lots and lots of seven spots and still not found the scarce one. Where do you need to look for them? What's the best chance of finding them?
Okay, so the best place is really to look for wood ants. So if you go to a sort of coniferous woodland or a heathland that has wood ants, I think Formica rufa is the main species. Is that right, Helen? Have I got that name right? I think it's a large red wood ant. That's where you'll find them. They seem to only be found in this country in association with those wood ants. So if you're finding a ladybird that looks like a seven spot in a garden, it's almost certainly going to be a seven spot. But then again, always worth perhaps flipping it over and just checking for those white markings on the underside, just in case.
And of course, to go to some of when we're allowed and restrictions are more lifted, to go to some of the sites where you might see them, for example, the Surrey Heaths, a wonderful wildlife trust site there.
Okay, another question, Pete, about where do you look for particular ladybirds, and the ones associated with trees that you find on the bark. Is there a particular place on the tree? Should you be looking under the bark, on top of the bark? What's the best approach to that?
Those ones are often fairly obvious on the bark, you know, perhaps on the trunks or the branches. So things like particularly the kidney spot ladybird. So it's some of the ladybirds that feed on scale insects. Seem to be the ones that they're presumably foraging for those on the bark. Also, pine ladybirds might be found in that way. So you don't really normally need to root around lifting bits of bark up. You can see them on the surface. They may be hiding away in little nooks and crevices, you know, in the evenings or when it gets a bit cooler. But really, just on the surface, hopefully you can see them. Most ladybirds would tend to be found more on the foliage, but it's just those 2 or 3 examples that might be more on the bark.
Okay, and perhaps we've got time for just one last question then, and this, perhaps Helen, if this takes us back to the 5-spot ladybird, and there are a couple of questions about the fact that it is so restricted to that habitat. How is it adapted to the river shingle? What does it eat? And then the other question that came in was whether this year's floods will have affected it for better or worse.
So really excellent questions. And actually, Pete and I have had the pleasure of supervising a PhD student working on the 5-spot ladybird, Rachel Farrow. So we've been finding out a little bit more, but I have to say there's so much more still to find out about the species. And it's a species that's widespread in continental Europe, or more widespread. So we think it's sort of an edge of range species here, and that's why it's on these particular habitats that are a little warmer, for instance, for it. But yeah, lots and lots of unanswered questions regarding the flooding. Actually, Pete and I took a trip to find some along the River Severn quite a number of years ago, and we were really interested to see that when we looked in flood debris, and I don't know why it was that we decided to look in amongst the flood debris, but we did, there were adults nestled into that debris. So I think they have a variety of different ways of coping in those flood situations, for instance. The other thing that also I noted when the larvae were around is that as the summer progresses, you can find them a little bit further back into the herbaceous vegetation and away from that river shingle. So I think that maybe does suggest it's something to do with the temperature and the warmth that is created along in that microhabitat. But a fascinating species, one we would love to know more about, particularly in terms of its life history here in the UK. But yeah, we're very grateful to Rachel for finding out more for us.
Okay. Great. There's one or two questions we haven't had a chance to answer, but I think we'll try and pick those up and provide a feedback document along with the recording of the webinar. But I think time-wise, we probably need to draw this one to a close, Helen. And is it 12:15 that we're due in for the next one?
That's right, and everyone is very welcome to join us for the next webinar. We thought we'd have a little bit of a break in between so everybody can move around, but we really hope you'll join us at 12:15 and we'll talk you through some of the larvae. But thank you all very much, and thank you Pete, Martin and Caroline as well. As always, I thoroughly enjoyed sharing Ladybirds with you. Speak to you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.